Salutations and welcome to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm Alexander Ath, and today on the podcast we are so excited to welcome back mystic, occult book publisher, and author, Mr. Gabriel McCaughry. Gabriel is a French-Canadian author from Montreal and also the founder and owner of Anathema Publishing, which publishes books on the occult, self-transformation, and spirituality. Gabriel sat down to chat in a previous podcast episode about occult bookmaking and his own approach to his work as a publisher and author, so if you haven't already, definitely check out that podcast as well. In today's episode, Gabriel returns to chat about his new book, Auroræ, which is described as a menagerie of so many various concepts woven together in a synthesis. His book is described as a mystifying, albeit utterly profound journey, part ontological synthesis, philosophical rambling, magical diary, a visual grimoire, an inspired mystical poem, a revelatory individualization process, and part alchemical vessel of expression. And the book also exists under the umbrella of what the author refers to as Gnostic Luciferianism. This one goes deep, listeners, into the spiritual, alchemical, and transcendent aspects of one's own development, which to me is one of the keys to developing the self, or no self as it were, when engaging in magical operations. And now to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you Mr. Gabriel McCaughry. Gabriel McCaughry, thank you so much for coming back on and joining us on the Glitch Bottle podcast today, sir.
Thank you so very much, Alex. It's always a pleasure. Yeah, after that introduction, is there anything to add? We could close it right. Everything's been said, so yeah, it was fun. Thank you.
Wow, that was the best podcast. That was the shortest podcast I think we've ever done.
Yeah, pretty efficient.
It was such a pleasure talking to you last time, and I really want listeners to check out the first interview we did. But here, Gabriel, we're talking about your new book, which is Auroræ, and this kicks off so many questions and so many great topics. And why don't we start with a quote just to kind of kick things off and set the frame. This is a quote from your book, Auroræ, and we can get into the meaning of the quote and kind of the genesis afterwards. Here's the quote. Through the great work, life became a project, and death was no longer seen as a distant lover, but as an extension of this same project. Work was no longer a chore, but a passionate calling. The mind no longer a prison, but a testing and training ground. The body no longer a nuisance, but a restored shrine. Wounds and scars became badges of honor, with each revealing the gold underneath the lead, complementary notes of a complex and ever-evolving melody, its echo producing waves crossing through the walls of the perceptual asylum. The soul itself became a revolution. Gabriel, can you tell us a little bit about this tome that you've written? There's so much beautiful poetry and symbolism and meaning behind it. So can you share a little bit about either that quote and what is Auroræ all about? What's the overall premise?
Well, I'll start with the quote, if you don't mind. The quote, of course, seems overly poetic and has this optimistic tone to it. I like it a lot, and that's why I use it sometimes promoting the book, because it seems like it makes a big synopsis, or it kind of represents the work under a certain light, which I absolutely love, because the work has a conclusion that is rather optimistic, but very realist at the same time. I definitely like the note that it's profoundly enlightening, if you will. But the reality, if you take, the quote out of context, of course, it also hints back at some of my personal struggle when I was a bit younger. And these are very dark. These are very dark times. Underneath the quote, of course, is a good message, but the process that I had to go through, or that the entire book goes through, to arrive at this conclusion, of course, like, is of a darker nature. But Auroræ as a whole is not a dark book at all, because that wasn't the point, and that wasn't my idea at all with this book. This book is purely about personal alchemy, if you will. That particular quote really ends back at some darker times. I remember like writing it because I was having this epiphany, this moment where things had changed, and I could really analyze and realize truly what was in front of me, that everything had changed through the great work, as you said, but also all of these of operation my entire life, but I even reverberating through the many spheres around me, say like even other dimensions, my entire life and perhaps beyond had changed. I started in this life being of a dark nature, I guess, or really living through bad stuff, if you will. And that was my Nigredo level. That was my black metal level. that was my phase, that it wasn't just like a metaphor. It was truly like I had a lot of things that I had to shed, and something needed to die. And I say that in the most positive way. Something had to die for it to be resurrected. So this quote really frames the whole book, but it also, in its context, in the book itself, it really explains something. So that's pretty much about the quote.
You mentioned it is about, personal alchemy, and so many people think about the Philosopher's Stone, and they might know a little bit about alchemy, but can you just share, Gabriel, a little bit more about what you mean when you say that this book really is about, personal alchemy?
It is a tough question to narrow down to like a simple definition. As you said, like the book covers a lot of things, and I'd say like this wasn't truly intentional. It's just how things got presented to me and how I related, the entire journey with it, really. But yeah, it's a really unorthodox book, both in tone and presentation. But I wouldn't say that it's so unorthodox that it doesn't fall in line with the alchemical tradition. As you've seen, it's partly a visual grimoire as well, and Jose Gabriel Alegría Sabogal did an amazing job. That guy, we could talk about it later, but it's almost a brother in the art, really, in the most awesome sense of the word. I mean, that guy got me and got the writing and understood the vision, and we worked for over 4 years on this book. But I say that because we truly wanted to do something that had to do with tradition, but that would also propel it in the future. I mean, as in acknowledging, the grounding of the alchemical work, but really saying, hey, we need new work like this. We need new works in the 2000 something that'll keep alchemy relevant, at least personal alchemy, and not just in so we're going to talk about the historicity or the history of alchemy, but really have a new alchemical work. Yeah, so if I can advance an enlightened hypothesis about my own book, because even I, to this day, even though I wrote the damn thing, I'd say the premise of the book still eludes me to some, and still shows me, I still discover a lot of things through that book. The book is threefold, and I believe I mentioned it at the very end. So it's an operation, right? Auroræ is an operation in numerous steps, numerous alchemical steps. Hence the name Auroræ, which means the many dawns, or realizing the many dawns, if you will. So each and every step is a small beginning, if you will, encompassed in a great dawn, or dawning. But what I've come to realize as I was writing it, as I was living it, as I was doing the rituals, is that I've come to realize what it truly means, what it entails to constantly nourish the flame and having the will to inspire. That's one thing. To understand our right as human beings, if you will, to be inspired, and how to, or, as a goal maybe, to become inspiration itself. And I know this may sound vague, but trust me, to me it makes a lot of sense, even if you read the book. But this principle, inspiration, really detailed like this in a threefold manner, is a living archetype. And it's also a divine extension of the self, if you will. that's basically the gist of it, I guess. It showed me, like, in a more personal way, it showed me how to plant the seeds and how to care for them and how to grow my own personal mythos. So what you're reading, even though I'm trying to detach myself from the book itself, and that is also partially explained in the beginning, because I wanted to create something that was not just subjective, even though it starts from a subjective standpoint. I wanted to do something that was still a general thing that could be used despite the system you're in, despite the religion you're in, and be inspired by it. That's pretty much the idea. Doing this and to be able to fully grasp it, it took some considerable reevaluation of values, and through it, of course, a deepening of virtue, and that was very important. So, like, I had to really analyze myself and going through the epiphanies, and I was guided actually through numerous, like, ritualistic workings. And then as it unfolded, then some more cryptic things I could talk about, but then I came to understand what it meant to find and choose for yourself a new name, almost quote unquote, like a new name. Understand that this new name is of a subtler nature, that I would need to bring that name and write it into the book of life myself, as a creator myself, if you will.
How do you see the book itself? Does it represent your own personal kind of universe and how you apprehend and assert your own alchemical and spiritual will throughout the universe, or does it really reflect kind of a combination of different elements? What does it represent to you?
It represents a blueprint of sort, but I'd say, like, weirdly enough, it's a combination of a man or being drawing or putting the finishing touches on said blueprint, but analyzing it at the same moment. So the hand is guided by something, by a force of sort. That blueprint is really like what Auroræ is about, is to figure out either, like, if you want to add to the blueprint and how to analyze it in your own word, in your own language, with your own kind of, like, spiritual semantics, if you will. So that's why I'm referring to, like, a new name. That's basically it. When I say name, it's kind of like the logos. It's really like the same concept, but taken from a more, I don't like to say, because, like, some people would refer it to, like, almost a left-hand path, kind of like leaning, because you're kind of like unfolding your own self-divinity, if you will. And indeed, there's, under a certain light, it could seem like that, but I do believe it's a bit more than that. It goes beyond just, like, analogies of left or right. But yeah, I mean, like, this new name I've come to find is really the root of all consciousness. So this blueprint really is like the naos. It's like the temple of the self. It's like the one point. It's the axis mundi around which you should really focus all of your attention, because nothing else matters or nothing else makes sense otherwise. So if you don't start by that, I do believe you're kind of missing out on something. So, and I'm not saying this as in, like, it's an imperative or it's mandatory. It's just the way it was presented to me. And when I say that, is of course through a lot of ritual workings, a lot of, like, meditation, a lot of pondering, a lot of also psychological work. But it's truly, I was like, Auroræ, or these first operation or whatever that became, is truly the solid foundation that I now have to either dismantle or realize perhaps that some of the aspects were wrong, some of the aspects were golden, and what am I taking from this? But this needed to be there. It's truly like the first stone that you put, to build the edifice. And that's my way to do this. And sometimes I believe, like, all of us are very overly eager. All of us are super curious. We read a lot. We read a lot about many different things. And of course, I'm not guilty of that, but I certainly did that with that book. There's a lot of influence in there. And sometimes, because it took so much time to write it, some of the parts are way older. Some of the parts I discarded, of course, through the years. But some of them I was like, is there still a reason why this part is still there? And at the end, I was pretty happy with the end result. But nonetheless, it's still a work in progress, even to this day, of course, because it's very personal. So I'm already somewhere else, but I was still pretty happy to present the book as being, look, this is the ground for me. This is my foundation. From there on, you'll see stuff like unfolding because of that through my various other books that I intend to write, of course. I'm already working on a new one, but it's going to be different. It's going to be different, but I hope that people understand the important part and what I'm trying to convey is not just to follow whatever was written. It's truly to do the same. It's truly to find your own kind of basis, your own base for your work. So like all these fancy words truly like could seem like it's a culmination of work and it's a coagulation of sort, if I'm using alchemical terms, but that it would be something worthwhile and, you know, massively important. And of course it is for me. But I also find that it's merely the beginning of my journey. Hence why I still think to this day that the conclusion of the book is truly the most important part for me. It's also the one I have written relatively recently because the book was finished in November of 2016. And then afterward, like, of course, I had to correct and edit, and that took a while before it was presented and I could publish it. But, you know, it really, this book and the beginning of my journey really raised the bar. You know, it raised everything up and it helped me try to, you know, kind of gather and push forth together the powers of the above and the below. And really in the laboratory of the body, mind, soul apparatus, if you will. This is how you create more philosophical space. And not philosophical as in what we understand of philosophy, but you know, more relating to the philosopher's stone. It's space really that you allow yourself to breathe in and you allow yourself to develop. So it's truly a laboratory you're developing inside, but of course that will grow even outside and that will take more importance in your life. It will heal you. It will definitely make you grow. I briefly touched upon that, like very briefly in my preface to the latest pillars entitled The Scalding of Sapientia. I don't know if you read it or if you've seen it, but perhaps you could do me the honor and read the quote. It could give you an idea of what I mean to say by creating philosophical space.
You say here, quote, creating philosophical space for time to unfold at one's desired pace, space for thoughts to bloom and rise, space for emotions to fully develop, and space that is sorely missing from the pursuits and priorities of modern man is a primordial undertaking for the adept. This space, if nurtured, will grow to resemble the ever-expansive nature of universal physical space. In doing so, this ever-expanding philosophical space and the combined gravity of the esoteric bodies that populate said space adds increasing pressure to one's prima materia, thus creating a singularity. As the mountain may, over time, transform minerals into the finest gems, so too may man, in like fashion, produce his own monolith or philosopher's stone, unquote.
It is a dynamic process. It is the breath. So breath, as we know, is of course like the basis again and foundation for everything that has to do with esotericism and the mysteries and all of that and understanding yourself better. It's really about knowing yourself means you want to create more philosophical space. And what I mean by that is that the breath enlarges. You create a larger space for your breath to expand and retract and have this dynamic process that you were referring to. So, of course, there's no proper way to express all of this just using words, you know, and semantics, because it seems like language always falls too short. I mean, to provide like a good outline. But that being said, I mean, just, you know, words about the mysteries can only vaguely point in the direction or another, but, you know, the path will always remain blurry. I believe our compass from the get-go is a bit inadequate. But if you really work on the pressure, the internal pressure, as in I'm referring in the quote, this pressure, paradoxically speaking, will create more space. And what I mean by that is, of course, it's internal space, but it's also almost radioactive, if you will. Because the more you allow yourself that space, that breathing space, that space for you to grow inside as a person, as an individual, but also as a divine being, it will radiate outward. So that's why I was saying that it also mimics kind of like the ever-expansive nature of universal space, because we know that the bodies are usually, it enlarges to infinity and infinities and beyond. But I believe the internal self works kind of like how the pulmonary system works. So it's inflation, deflation all the time. But through processes of inflation like this can also mimic infinity. This can also take ludicrous proportions and, of course, go outwardly and then affect all of your surroundings. So in a weird way, it is also a way to work the magic. But it's a magic that'll definitely start from you. That'll definitely start not from the calling upon a force that is greater than you. Of course, whenever I do that in the book, and I hope this wasn't too vague because I even had a hard time understanding it myself, but everything has a correlation, but a direct one. It's not separated at all. There's no separation. So there's always this golden thread in between you, the divine self, a certain type of angel or a certain type of demon or entity or what have you, or God or divinity. All of this is like tied into the same link, to the same golden thread. So I found, anyway, this is by no means any empirical fact, because I don't want to speak like that. And it's just like how things came to me, I guess. And now I'm trying to clumsily put words on that, but there's a reason why it's called, like we call it the ineffable mysteries. Subjectively speaking, I could say that I find that all of these experiences all together, they constituted like a validation or a confirmation of the work. That's why Auroræ is presented this way. That's why it's also presented in a way to encourage the others to discover that force within that will radiate outward, to try to work on their own mythopoetic journey or quest, and thread their own path instead of trying to mimic mine or mimic anyone else. As a matter of fact, instead of repeating what somebody else did, you can verily take a lot of good work. There's so many great books, great teachings, great organizations out there that can verily provide you with a foundation or basis if you need to. But how do you take this, bringing into yourself for it to grow said philosophical space? To me, this is primordial. So it ties, of course, with meditation. It ties, of course, with psychological understanding of the self, individuation process. All this is tied with this inflation, deflation, this breathing process, if you will. To me, this is very Luciferian in and of itself. But we'll get to that. But
I know a lot of the listeners, like myself, are very, very passionate about ceremonial magic, for example, right? And stepping into the circle and working with spirits. Well, there is this tension in the ceremonial magic community, and you just hit on this, which is you want to show fidelity to the sources and the texts that you're working from, the grimoires. But in working those, ideally, every magician out there wants to synthesize those sources and eventually develop a highly eclectic, highly individualized system that is theirs. That is their system. It may have the fingerprints of other grimoires and other systems, but it's what works for you. So your book, to me at least, struck me as you took, as you say, these kind of, archetypal themes, and yet your work, this book right here, Auroræ, represents your own individualization alchemical process. And I think that's really important, just for listeners to understand a little bit.
But it's more of a reflection on how it helped me as well. Because sometimes it's the other way around, because of course, and I'm such a fan of your podcast that I've listened to all of the episodes, so I'm very aware that most of your invited guests are deep into the ceremonial magic, and so are you. I'm in awe in front of so much dedication, and usually the minutia and the details and how people express themselves through that. To me, this is unbelievable because it takes a lot of work, and this to me is a noble trait. And I absolutely adore it. Truly, I'm not saying the way I went at things is proper. It just seemed like the only way to go at it. You need to understand that, of course, we always have a choice, But truly, like, the way I go at things is normally I don't do rituals and then expect something out of it, and that's the whole point of the game. I really, like, most time I just meditate. Most time it's more about the study itself than the application. Once in a while, it seems like that through this intense meditation or this intense, like, mystical approach, if you will, then I'm bombarded with new information about how to then conduct a ritual that will make sense to my own progress at this particular instance. Hence why I could not even subscribe to a particular system more than just like kind of find what was resonating with me at a deeper level, integrate this into whatever I was doing at the moment in accord to the only system that I follow, which is alchemy. It's debatable if alchemy is even a system, really. It probably isn't, or it was to proto-chemists, but that's not at all my approach to alchemy anyway. I'm not so interested into the transmutation of metal more than I am to the allegories and the metaphors and the illustration and the symbology around alchemy that really speaks to me at a deeper level. But so whenever I'm at a certain point, then that's when, all the elements will come together and will be transmitted to me, if you will, from, the various psychopomos, the various entities, if you will, that I believe populate my space, my philosophical space. And they help me out tremendously. And then they suggest to me processes and ways to go at it and workings. And now they become imperative. I need to do them, and I need to understand what it unlocks. So, like, these are all various keys that you give me, but it's as if, like, the door itself wasn't present at the moment. I have to build it. So it's weird. It's like kind of the other way around. It's like you're given a key, and you don't even know what the key's supposed to open. You kind of need to build the apparatus that you need to unlock afterward. But, of course, these things unlocks things in the self. Hence why, whether you like it or not, I really enjoy Jung's body of work in general, but even more so like the latest things he did like in his life, because he was embracing a bit more the mystical aspect of himself. And I got this cool quote right there that I picked out of the blue because, Jung stated in his Liber Novus, the sacrifice that magic demands is solace. To me, that represents pretty much everything that I find so amazing about it, because I'm a guy that works constantly. I love the work, and I believe it's through working on the self that you'll pretty much discover not only what this life is about, but how can you push it even further. So I'm more interested into like what we call the vertical work instead of like the horizontal, but that's just a matter of choice. I prefer to work on the scent. So I don't know, to me, like following the grimoires to a T is amazing. I guess I don't understand it fully. It's a fascination that I have hearing about it, hearing the podcast, reading about it, but the way the mysteries are presented to me and how to work with them, I couldn't possibly pick a classical grimoire and work it from start to finish. And I could probably do it as an experiment, but it's not the way it seemed. Logical is not even the right term, but you know where I'm going with this. I'm not to say it's not for me, because perhaps in life my outlook on this will change. But at the moment, and for this precise work and this book particularly, it truly made no sense. It was me having transmissions, penning down those transmissions, trying to understand what was veiled behind those inadequate word, because the experience, or I don't even know if it's in the world of phenomenon, but it was so mind-altering and soul-altering, it truly changed everything. And I mean, everything it was impacted in my life from that point on.
Can you share with us about exactly what you mean, Gabriel, by Gnostic Luciferianism? Because I think some listeners out there might be, of course, thinking about Gnosticism, traditional classic Gnosticism, and others might be thinking of Luciferianism and left-hand path stuff and, the Promethean-style liberator archetype of Lucifer. So what do you mean by Gnostic Luciferianism?
Well, you got it right there. Like, even if it was a synthesis of both things that you just mentioned, I wouldn't see why this would be so contradictory. To me, it makes a whole lot of sense. The only thing I could dare say about it, of course, will be my own subjective interpretation, because it seemed that anyone you ask about, what Luciferianism is, has a different take on it, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps it's a way to intentionally blur the lines between what is subjective and objective, hence why even this terminology seems to evade any type of proper definition. I don't know, but if we go into it, I'd say Luciferianism is an heterodox viewpoint. And I touch upon this in the book. I mean, at the beginning, anyway, the book, there's a section of the book that's called Neoteric Heterodoxy, right, in Auroræ. But that was supposed to be the name of the book at the beginning, actually. It's only when I decided to include all the poetic parts, all the poetic kind of like transmission and all the poetically inspired experiences that I had, that I also had this revelation that I needed to change the title. But like the more philosophical part, if you will, or used to be about Luciferianism and my interpretation of it. And for me, that was all about heterodoxy. Hence why in the book I also explain why even proto-Gnostic sects used to be heterodox by definition. And to be heterodox really is a philosophy and a personal initiatic process, if you will. It's a practice that is about initiation, but ongoing initiation. You could hardly call it a movement or a group or something like that. And if you have some people that would tell you otherwise, what I would vehemently disagree, because I don't think Luciferianism is even meant to be like this, some type of church or group or cult or whatever. So when I say that Luciferianism is heterodox by definition, what I mean is that it's in contradistinction to orthodoxy, which literally means the right way of thinking or conformity, if you will. On the other hand, of course, heterodox will help you to think otherwise or think outside the box. So that's why I think my work falls into like the categories of Luciferianism, because as you said, it's like threading your own path, like making your own picture, painting your own picture. So this whole viewpoint really helps you to change your way in the pursuit of greater wisdom. It's a way to step out of categorization altogether about what is considered the norm, and we can even say consider the norm into magical systems. It's not because we are talking about esotericism or the occult in general that there are not norms even into that. For me, this is really like where, like the step out of categorization is very important, because there are a general consensus about reality, quote unquote reality, of what's good, what's bad. Sometimes it's culturally or environmentally implemented in your life. The very definition really about Luciferianism and why I say Gnostic Luciferianism is because we know that the proto-Gnostic sects from the first or second century BC, they had like a very right-hand path notion of dissolution into a higher being, whether you call it a god or something, or anything else, but minus the obligatory notion of sin, or their way of seeing sin was very different from nowadays, like a conception of sin. Of course, they had the demonization of the flesh and of matter, and I to me, Luciferianism is really not about that, though. But the fact that, like Gnostics didn't have to rely on a higher authority or a higher human being as an authority to, say, reach salvation, and that they all had a spark of the divine within, and also that they understood that there was archonic influences in this plane that were nefarious to spiritual progress and to the free flow of life in general. That's why I believe Luciferianism uses a lot of Gnostic terminologies, because for me, those archonic influences and whatever like impedes your progress is really in the spiritual world all around us, but also in real life. But when I say by real, I mean there's different levels of realities. But in all those different levels of realities, there are things that will create psychic and psychological blockages. and you just have to think about our educational pre-programming, but also environmental, cultural, but also cosmological, blockages and pre-programmings that we have, that these will create, of course, problems, personal flaws. They'll show you your limitation or your demons, really. But these you'll have to fight back. And that's what I loved about the Gnostic approach. The Gnostic approach used to consider this as a fighting ground or testing ground, if you will. The mundane level, had to be something that was a trialing period or a level, that you need to kind of like fight your way through in order to break free of the endless cycle of inertia, so to speak. The only thing that I would say, like Luciferianism, or my subjective interpretation of it really differs, is that I don't see this flesh or matter as a prison. I don't see it really as a prison. Or, it starts with the premise that if you do, it's a rather internal one, and it's a prison of your own concept, really. It's not an actual prison. It's not something that's been imposed to you. So when I say also that if I refer back to the archonic influences, I'm not saying these are external to you. I'm saying they are there. Instead of trying to break free of this prison and blame somebody else for this, perhaps you should understand better the configuration and the blueprint of this room you're in, and not escape it by trying to tunnel your way out and cheat your way out, but really like try to understand how you could normally just step out of the room and understand it was no prison at all. But even saying this to you took me some considerable time to even get the basic idea of what I was trying to illustrate with this, because I don't think Gnostic Luciferianism is something that is widespread, or I don't think it's something that is very popular. But also, I would say I began to first see the thing in a very Gnostic way, being like, okay, so we got to rebel against something. We got to, of course, there's a cosmic kind of like demiurge, or like this kind of like a tyrant. And Auroræ touches upon that. But I hope that people stick through the entire reading until they uncover what the end is about and the conclusion is about, because in all honesty, that's where you discover that it was no prison at all. And there's no such tyrant beside the one you're making. And those demons are yours, but they're of your own creating as well. Hence why you would say like Luciferianism tends to be equated with the left-hand path, because it's all about the self-making process, that's for sure. To me, Luciferianism is not just a philosophy or a religion, but as I've said in the book, it's more of a Liberian. I'll leave it to people to read the book to understand what I mean by that.
For the listener who has not read your book yet, what are these different codex-based chapters about in book one?
The whole of Auroræ contains 4 alchemical degrees, and a 5th hidden one, if you will. It's not hidden because it's presented in the book, but it's even more cryptic in tone. It's basically, I want to say it's a degree or anything like that, but it definitely hints at what lies next on the path. It's really messages from the psychopomp within, or the mentor guide within. So there's 4 first alchemical degrees are presented into like the poetic part of Auroræ. There's a 5th one, of course, but the 5th one is very different, and I hope people understand why it is, but I won't tell you too much about that. And the way it works, it's a pentalphic formula. And when I say about pentalphic formula, it's of course it's a 5-fold formula that grounds the work, for you, as I've said, to build a stronger edifice out of it. It equates the 4 or 5 first degrees of alchemy that normally like people are pretty much aware of that, and that constitute the formula which, if you bundle it up, what the ancient called the lesser stone. So that's not something that's necessarily pointed at as being obvious in the book, and necessarily so, but it was truly like the building blocks of my own lesser stone. But I thought it was great to have this analogy between like the divine birds, because that's also like another symbol of alchemy that's very widespread and understood, but also like to have these presented in a way that, look, this is my divinely inspired poetry. But what if you were to work on your own? And it's not obligatory that's necessarily poetry. It could be anything else. It could be like, in order for you to uncover your lesser stone, what would you have to live? What would acknowledge these states, like these 5 states, this pentalphic formula? And like I said, the fact that it's 5-fold formula, but it's also alpha formula, what I mean by that is that each and every one is a beginning, as I've said earlier on. It's like each and every one of them is a dawning. So these are all grounding works, but I'm not talking about the last 2 or 3 steps that make up for the greater stone. That is something else entirely. That is not something I'm going to get into, nor that is touched upon in the book itself. That's where I was at the moment, and that's where the book stops, if you will. So each and every poetic part for me, they acknowledge a more refined state. And they're trying, of course, to put images and words on something you cannot describe. But as in any good alchemical book, it's also a way to distract the mind. Weirdly enough, in order for you to forget altogether about the thinking aspect of it, you have to distract, I don't like this term, but whatever, you have to distract the monkey mind, right? With something. Distracting the monkey mind through these inspired poetry, to me, was the best way to access something that was truly silent. That was kind of like the golden silent underneath it all. But it's like, you have to give the mind something to play with. So, and it's also a way to, whilst the mind plays with this, then it's as if like you give it like a bit of your ego too. And the ego's left to marinate in its own, I wouldn't say in its own filth, but the ego is marinating, trying to understand and trying to put everything into logical terms, which of course it fails to do. And so like the ego, it slowly intoxicates itself with its own toxin until it's like reduced to like silence, reduced to impotence, really. That's what these 5, first alchemical degrees are about. Really, they're about presenting, of course, the alchemical work by the metallic aspect of lead, and then the subsequent, different metals, but also the different birds in works such as the language of birds. You have to start with the lead because it's the heaviest of the 7 metals and it's considered, limited and refractory to change and transmutation. So yeah, it's a symbol status and refuses to grow too. So that's where you need to start. That's why, the first stage is called the Nigredo level, and then it also, the entirety of this journey really represents, man taking into his own hand his own destiny, so to speak, and trying to transcend his own limit by going through this journey to overcome fate. And I've discussed it recently with a few people, and the overcoming of fate thing is really like an embracing more than fighting and defeating something. It's more embracing something about the self that makes everything fall in line. So that's pretty much the idea of this first part, this first poetic part.
Would you expect the reader at that point, to move on to the Neoteric Heterodoxy in Book 2? And then can you just tell us where do they go in Book 2? Where does Book 2 take them?
It's not necessarily a linear experience like reading this book. Actually, I don't know if you had these in the States. You probably did. But I don't know in English what that was translated at. We had books that were called
Choose Your Own Adventure?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I love those. It was like, turn to page 83 if you want to. Yeah.
So I was thinking about like the French version, but of course, same thing. All right, same thing. So it was intentional for me to put these parts, these books in that order. It was intentional, but it's not meant to be solely read in a linear fashion. And what I mean to say by that, and I hope the introduction did a good job at explaining this, because I say it in the introduction, it was willfully so that, the first part is very cryptic and very poetic, and you need, like I was saying, to have the monkey mind or whatever, like, you need to throw yourself in the poetry without wanting to analyze it too thoroughly and try to make sense of it all. It's very abstract in a way. Just so you know, and then I say it at the end of this first part, there are keys hidden in there. And what I mean to say that there are keys of understanding. Of course, there were keys of understanding for me. I'm not saying necessarily somebody would automatically understand what those keys are. The second part really grounds the book in more mundane terms, or it's really more the philosophical part. It's really the part where, okay, so we started with kind of like the madness, and now here's what's kind of neutral about the work, or here's how I define certain things, and here's why I believe that, we should put some more emphasis in doubting, like I talk about the divine doubt. I talk about so many things during that part, because this part was really important for me to say, okay, well, there's a lot of interpretation of what Luciferianism is out there. So here's my take on it. And for me, that's why, the second part also encompasses a small lexicon of terms. These terms were sometimes personal, sometimes divinely inspired, sometimes just random terms I choose to use, despite the system I may have borrowed them from. So all of this for me was a way to say, okay, this is why, I'm so deeply involved into alchemy, why I think it's the best way to interpret the self, the vibrational states, that you can go through. This reads more, the second part, I believe so, reads more like your typical book. Not typical in a negative light at all, just more a normal way to present the book. The third part was what was the many operation that I did that led me through the entire Auroræ thing, experiment. Again, the way I presented it was to write it as a third person, because I was I wanted to kind of the make up your own quest you were talking about. I wanted it to be described as a quest, pretty much. And so, if you understand it as a quest, then you're reading somebody else's quest, and you can be inspired to do the same, but you won't be led into having to reproduce these things. And that's what I wanted to avoid as much as possible, because I was I'm by no means a teacher. I'll be a student for my entire life. I don't want to present this as a new grimoire, per se. It's a grimoire part because that's how I did my rituals, but it has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with the reader. It has nothing to do with this compulsion to be oh, I did this and it worked for me, so automatically do it and it'll work for you. So book 3 is really something I wanted to separate from the self, and at the same time say okay, this is really, you're reading a story right now. This is how the story impacted my life. Now, how will you go about and write your own? That's pretty much the idea. So these 3 parts, they work in conjunction, of course. One weaves into the other. And at the very, very end, that's why I needed to, when I was reading it, I was well, this needs an appendix or a few appendices. That's why I included even more dry interpretation of what, alchemically speaking, the first poetic part really means. So I don't know why I needed to include that last part. I believe some people will really appreciate it. Some people might say it was unnecessary, depending on your understanding of alchemy. But to me, it was okay, so within that first poetic part, these are the keys, that help me. These are the keys of interpretation, and that's how they fall into more broad conceptions of alchemy and what they refer to about. So yeah, that's pretty much the whole structure of the book. So why it's kind of a build your own quest thing is because I wanted people to go back to the first part and reinterpret them after they had read the entire book. After they had let everything in, for it to macerate a bit, for it to ferment and do, all that good stuff, and then go back to it and understand new things under this new light, whatever I brought afterward.
That is fantastic. And yeah, I think that's such a great point that, readers really are not being dictated to in this book. They're not being said, you need to do this and this is the only way. In fact, you kind of give readers all of the water, and then it's up to the readers to kind of boil the water and make their own, alchemical steam. And when I think
on the bed, on the bedrock of it all will be your salt. That's pretty much it. The steam, that's a good analogy. Of course, it's a very alchemical one too, but, okay, so steam, like there's this fire, and then evaporation. And of course, okay, so the clouds, and it'll bring it. So what you're saying, and I'll do a bad job at it because I didn't have the time to note it down. But so if I'm to take this metaphor, then if I did that, if I boil my own water, and then it got transferred into the air. And then for me, there was a gem inside there. There was my own salt. And if I'm worth my salt, that's something else that I'm going to have to investigate. That essence is transferred in the air. It's transferred in the clouds. And then it reaches you. And it falls under your head whilst you're reading the book. That new rain, that rainwater is pouring over you. And then that was my transmission from my experiment to you, the reader. And then the reader has to do the same with said water and then uncover their own salt.
Why is poetry one of the principal vehicles that you choose to use to convey these messages?
This will be a very dry answer because, in this world and in the exploration of my own progress, what I truly enjoy is vocabulary. I speak French on a day-to-day basis, and English is relatively new in my life, or it's not new. I learned it when I was young. Then I had to be on the road with a band for years to get better acquainted with it. But it's truly relatively new in my life. What I mean to say that upon reading so many great books, and I really enjoy, reading mystical poetry, Rumi and the stuff like that. And there's so many great ways, or even I believe when I was very young, the first book that got given to me that is somewhat of a mystical book, I believe I was 9, and it was a friend of my mom. She was kind of surprised that I was reading the Bible fairly regularly, but as it so happened, even when I was very, very young, I was reading parts of the Bible, and I was highlighting parts that I found were appalling. Parts that I was very against. That was very the beginning, I guess, of many other tiny things that would indicate later on in life that I would have this fascination for everything religious. Even in the rebellion against it, I was still very fascinated. And so just because of that, she brought me a copy of The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. It's a great book, and it's a widely spread book, actually. But she gave it to me because she was like, I really enjoyed that book, and you're very young, but you might like it anyway. So I hold on to this copy for a long time, and perhaps that's how my inclination for mystical poetry was born. I don't know. I just know that I have this fascination for the written word and the beautiful weaving of words, and how they don't tell you directly to do this or that. They just uplift you. They're uplifting, and the inspiration that they brought me, I wanted to convey back again. I wanted to give back. I wanted to engage in the same way in my book as some books impacted me in the past with that same type of mystical poetry. Of course, usually how it goes is through the different meditation or ritualistic work. Of course, rituals usually has a lot of orison, a lot of declaration, a lot of devotional passages. And sometimes I would just write them down very quickly. Sometimes they would come to me very naturally. But of course, what you're reading, if I'm very honest with you, what you're reading as the end product on the page, of course, they are corrected, highly revisited version that are kind of embellished for the pleasure of the reader. I would expect that from any good book or any presentation, because as long as people understand the heartfelt declaration that is in there. But it's not a bad thing that, you embellish the corners a bit and you lift it up, having a better even presentation. So that's why I really like poetry and how poetry impacts you. Yeah.
Are these principles just kind of so deeply ingrained that you just wake up in the morning and it's just part of your flow? Or how do you integrate this book?
The system unfolds itself. You're applying, of course, newly discovered information, or it's an ongoing initiation. You know, like there's two ways to understand initiation. Some people are like, well, you get initiated into a certain school or a certain system or, you know, and that's a one-time thing, or you may have like different gradation eventually. But there's also like the approach that initiation is ongoing and it's all your life and it's through the beyond and it's not something that's likely to. So like any new detail might have you bolt the other way and run for the hills or just do a 360 on yourself. There's a lot of it that, you know, you need to take under consideration. That's how I look at things. So normally I do these things not as a systemic approach. As I'm doing them, the system unfolds. That's different. I become the observer of said system and how I observe how it changes me. That's why I think the book is more mystically inclined than it is like a grimoire or that it is like a purely magical work. Of course, it worked its magic on me, but the system works its magic on me, but it's through observation of the layout. It's through observation of the unfolding, looking at the glorious painting or anything that is beautiful, or watching a movie that be life impacting, that you'd be like changed afterward. But it's through the act of the observation that you were changed, and transmutation does occur. Normally, with anything that inspires you to at the deeper level, at the core of your being, it seems like it unlocks automatically ways to go at it. So you'll be like, oh, so I got to take my life into my own hand, and tomorrow I'm opening my own business. Well, I did that, you know. So that's one of the good examples. You know, it's one of the many examples. But there are things that you'll do in the real world or in the mundane world, if you want, that will become obligatory. It will become mandatory for you to act upon a certain impulse. But that impulse would have not come to you if I didn't have this way of observing and a way of ritualizing each and every tiny aspect of my life. So by incorporating rituals, by incorporating a lot of time in philosophical space to devotion and through the work, and understanding now that what I'm doing through the publishing house and through what I'm doing in my private ritual space, what I'm doing in my relationship, whether it be with my girlfriend or whether it be with my friends or whether it be with my colleagues in the occult scene, if you will, all of this are all one thing. That's the beautiful unfolding that's in front of me. And so, of course, observation seems like it's a static thing, but it's not. It's very much like the quantum world. Like, through observation, you are verily altering the very fabric of the cosmos around you, of your immediate, and sometimes even the ripples go through way beyond your immediate surrounding. But this works the magic in and of itself. So you put ingredients in the athanor or the cauldron inside, and they boil down, they do that thing where they go from below to above, and it's kind of like a lava lamp, really, of things that's happening to you inside of you. They change you, and you'll understand new things. Those new things, you're going to observe them. So I'm really more of an observer, but I know that through observation, I also alter things. That's why I got this very small and very simple quote at some point in the book that says, to observe is to alter. And I believe it, to me, it's like almost a Luciferian motto, if you will. That's kind of like a symbol to say, like, well, through my act of observing the inside, like the within and the without, and understanding the intricacy of how the system kind of like connects together, well, I don't need to do much more than that. Of course, some people would truly want to do stuff that will go beyond, and then they'll work like the grimoire magic, say, for as an example, in a way to truly transcend the situation and connect with forces that are beyond comprehension. I don't think I'm doing this at this moment. I don't think that's what I'm doing. What I'm doing right now is way more focused on the self. It's what will allow me, or somewhat allow me, to connect with highest influences or higher influences. The self-reliant part, the being accountable. These to me are very Luciferian too. To be enlightened is one thing, or to try to be enlightened, I'd say, because it's not necessarily, you don't declare yourself enlightened by all means. But also, if you work real hard to try to shed light yourself, there are good chances that you'll work and you'll walk a path of enlightenment just by trying to be a light in this world and to others.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That too, Gabriel, brings up the concept, and you've touched on this before, about the monolith. Can you just share again for the listeners, because a lot of this has to do with, approaching the monolith is a section that you have in the book that I found very interesting. Can you just kind of detail, what does the monolith represent in the book?
The monolith has a lot of connotation. It is, in Jungian terms, the shadow self, or could be constituted as the shadow self. It is the constant imperative. It is the driving force. And when I say by this, it is the shadow self, it's something you really can rely on, that you can lean on, that will be always part of you, that will always be part of your shadow. But if you don't look for it, you're certainly going to pass by it, and it's never going to become concrete in your life. It's never going to materialize. So bluntly put, of course, it'd be easy for me to say that using the monolith as a symbol, for me, is truly the way to say the Philosopher's Stone. That's it. That's pretty much it. But the Philosopher's Stone doesn't say much. Some people see it as a holy grail of sort, or kind of like an Amrita elixir. It could be like endless life or life eternal or what have you. The Philosopher's Stone is no stone. Everybody knows that. People who are interested into alchemy know it. It is the stone that is no stone. But the monolith is a breathing mechanism too. It's like the tree of life and the tree of death condensed and combined. And at the same time, again, if it's not made concrete, it is vapor. It is nothing. So at first, I began with, the interest to work with the tree of life, the Sephiroth and the Klipot. I did so for a while, and because I work in a way where it's not just study, and then application of a rigid text, it kept on battling in my mind. It kept on merging and crisscrossing and cross-pollinating each other, and each sphere of influences seemed like they didn't have their right position alongside the proposed hierarchy or the proposed model. And that model really became more of a tri-dimensional model, or even fourth and fifth dimensional model. That's why it kind of materialized through oniric kind of messages too, because sometimes I'll really work onto creating a passageway through dream work. And in those dream work, that monolith really became something that was always following me, and sometimes really pressing heavy on my shoulder when it wanted to show me that you're really at the nigredo level, you're at the lead level. Then it was almost a burden. And that burden was the entirety of the tree of life and death, the entirety of the questioning that comes with it. Hence why I also tackled the subject of divine doubt and all that good stuff. But the never-ending question, the pursuit, why the pursuit? Why am I constantly, not cursed because that's too big of a word, but why am I so passionate but also burdened by this never-ending questioning process, labyrinthine journey to the pursuit of knowledge, and knowledge with a capital K, So the monolith expresses that in different ways. So as a system, because I can use it as a system if I want to. If I want to, then it becomes kind of like a weird personal representation of what I call the collapsing tree of life and death, because for me, both trees are really the same, and then they collapse onto themselves, and by collapsing onto themselves, they increase the pressure, of course, and they create the monolith. So as a system, I can use it like this. If I really want to focus on a certain aspect, and if I really want to attack a certain thing in my life that I would see need improvement or anything, I can very much put it to paper and work the monolith in that particular way. But also it became something much more. It became like universes into universes into universes. And then all together, that's why I just call it the monolith, because it seemed like it's this endless blackness, but not in a negative way. It's this never-ending pool. It's like this abyss, if you will. So, of course, when you're looking at the monolith, it does show you a certain reflection of yourself, but you can lose yourself in the reflection of it too. So the monolith poses a great challenge. It's almost like a sphinx-like also character, even though it's not a character, but it'll truly provide you with the enigma that could make or break you through the monolith. And I really say through the monolith because I believe that at some point you are invited to step in. So you step into the abyss of the monolith, and then there's no more reflection there. There's just a vibrational state that is the true self, if you will. But the true self is without any description, without any human way to express it. So yeah, the monolith is really something that I probably have to study and revisit all my life. All I know is that this is meant to stay. It's the only way I got to explain. So much so that I'd say like I don't really use any type of archetypal symbols of deities and all that good stuff anymore. Of course, just for fun, yes, I'll have like paintings and I'll have statues, but the only thing I can refer to is the monolith because it's purposely vague. It blurs the line between what you make as a conception of it. Of course, it's a stone, so for me it's a direct into the philosopher's stone, but it's the mystery. It's really a concrete manifestation of the mystery.
What place and role do the archons play in your book, especially in referencing the collapsing tree of life and death?
When you use it as a system, it's a tree of life and death. So if it is the case, there are certain zones, if you will, that are pretty much guarded, as you said, or led, or there are certain archons that have like dominion over a certain aspect of the tree. But this tree is an internal one. So my interpretation has nothing to do, it uses the metaphors like the Gnostic metaphors, but it has nothing to do with something external to the self. It's like more of the inner universe, if you will, whether it be like the demiurge or whether it be like the archons that I find is over this dominion. But then I'll be like, oh, so if I'm in let's say in a particular self-loathing phase, and it did in the past, less so now, but if I'm at a particular point in my life where it seemed like the self-loathing, it could be something like physical, it could be anything, right? But something really, whether it be psychological or even like a spiritual problem, issue that arises, then I'll try to like determine which archon, but it's an inner archon. It has nothing to do with, universal kind of like the way we think about archons as in angel or forces that are outside of the self. They're really like inner workings that are nefarious influences on the self. And I need to understand who and what this archetype represent, and then it'll show me how to dismantle, if you will, like their control. So it's really about dismantling, controlling parts that might come from external influences, but truly is how they impact you inside. So say I'm at a certain day job and I get bombarded with negative stuff by a certain individual there. Of course, you can blame the other individual, but in the end, you're always accountable for your reaction. You can only be accountable for what you can control, which is the self, and nothing else. So in a very, let's say, chaos magic aspect, you could very well take that guy, let's call him, I don't know, Bob or something like that. And Bob is a really pain in the ass, like at the office, right? But you could go home and usually instead of like doing like a ritual curse on Bob for him to fall down the stairs or something, you could work on it to represent Bob as in like, yes, but why is he so successful into producing that poison inside? That, that poison inside is festering, and is it truly Bob's fault, or have I a flaw there that I should address? So I know it's kind of like on the fly kind of type of analogy, but that's how I use the archon. That's how I use like in a broader kind of like ascent in a more vertical manner. That's how I see them as being degrees of spiritual blockages that needs to be overcome or that needs to be understood better. The analogy really is about dismantling the negative aspect of Gnosticism that is solely against matter and flesh-based experiences, as in the basis for all wounds and pain. I see, give them back like a sense of nobility, give back the wounds and the pain a certain spiritual and royal sense. And that's why you go through the bodily senses in the anamnesis of the pilgrim, the part where I'm talking about the bodily senses and how you embrace them anew. You forgive them, you work with them as if there were archetypal entities as well, and you understand where their limitation is, and by embracing said limitation, you transcend them because you understand them better. That's the same way I go with certain archons. And by all means, I'm not a pro in this. I'm not the guy who knows that much about it. I just, again, with everything, sometimes very instinctual. And I just like decided to focus on certain types of archons that I believe needed to be addressed. If they are indeed some kind of like tyrannical figures, or if they are trying to manipulate from the shadows, or if they are trying to limit the expansion and the expression of consciousness, or just trying to put, like roadblocks on my own alchemical journey, then that's who I need to target. But these are representations.
I think a lot of listeners might look at your book and go, well, this is an amazing book. Clearly this book is gearing me up so I can slaughter and conquer everything in front of me, and it's not quite like that. Can you talk about that?
No, it's not quite like that, indeed. No, because I make a distinction in the book between destiny and fate, which can seem paradoxical because often they are equated as being the same thing. And then I won't even go into, because again, I don't know enough about it to talk to you about it. It'd be akin to like a different conception of karma. I made a differentiation between destiny and fate because to me, destiny is a mechanism that is a controlling mechanism, if you will, that is really either internal or externally influenced, but both in conjunction, again, working together. They are really there to show you a way and show you a certain path and have you believe that there's no alternatives or there's no different ways to even interpret your own path. Fate is another thing. Fate, I cannot really go into because fate is pretty much the indescribable as well. But as far as destiny is concerned, how I see destiny, and the reason why I make this distinction, by the way, is because in French, there's le destin and there's la destinée. And pretty much they're also considered almost the same thing. But it was curious to me when I was reading in English, and I would see those two terms because I was like, well, okay, so le destin ou la destinée, what is it in English? And then it was, okay, destiny. I was like, yeah, but destiny is not fate, is it? And people were like, yeah, well, it is the same. Okay, but what if it wasn't? And it was just like a question of things. So I was like, because it's a psychological matter for me to reconciliate the karmic aspect, if you will. Because of course there are things you're led to do. You have a certain personality, you have certain things, and they are part of your, I wouldn't say programming, but they're definitely part of a system you might not be able to change that much. So you have a certain liberty, but is there. So that's why I'm also embracing the fact that fate encompasses illusions that needs to be dissipated, but you don't dissipate it as in, again, well, as you said, fighting against them. You dissipate them by embracing them and understanding that there's a reason that might elude you, that you might not understand, but there's a reason why these illusions are there. I'm not saying that it's kind of shitty that they're there, I guess, depending on how you look at it. But to me, I can usually break it down into 3 different illusions. And the first illusion, of course, is the illusion of freedom. How much wiggle room do you have? Like, are you actually free? Even if you work toward a certain type of freedom, really think about it and really be honest with yourself. And when you're really honest with yourself, that's how you get to know yourself better too. So, are you really free? Will you be very free? Will you work it your entire life to, and what is freedom? And then if you go in that rabbit hole, you'll probably never come out, So just that in and of itself is part of fate, is also part of destiny, but it's very important to understand this illusion. So to me, it's like, okay, so you have the illusion of freedom that is the major impediment in any spiritual progress. But then again, it's one of the illusions that you really need to ask yourself why it is there, what is its purpose, and really understood if the illusion itself is not part of a greater design. And if you need to embrace that illusion instead of fighting it. That's one thing. But these are more questions than answers. And that's what the book does too. It raises more questions than provides answers. And I hope people are okay with that. So illusion of freedom, illusion of safety, and the illusion of equality. These 3 illusions working together and working at different times, they really make the basis of like the trappings of destiny, as I call it. And the understanding and the embracing of the illusion, hence their dissipation, but still the limitation might still remain. They are part of the overcoming of fate that I was talking to you about. Of course, again, a lot of people have different interpretation, and that's okay. But yeah, the illusion of safety is another one. Is safety complacency? Is safety not getting involved? Or is safety something, is it a right? Is it something you have to acquire? Is it a duty? There's so many, I love these concepts and these quote unquote illusions that raise way more questions than they provide answer. To me, they are mysterious and they're magical in their own right. And then these 2, if say you were to cross the illusion of safety and freedom altogether, they reveal the illusion of what we call equality. And now I don't go into any type of politics, any type of anything that is mundane. I'm just talking about a sense of equality to what exactly? And in reference to what? And what is the grounding for everything? So I'm not talking human to human. I'm talking about you and the beyond. Or the ego self versus the real self, or all of this. How can you possibly even begin to determine on that vibrational scale where to begin and where it ends in order for you to properly assert that it'll be equal once it reaches X point? These 3 things, I know I kind of went my way in answering your question, Alex, and I apologize for that. But to me, that's a part that's very fascinating about the book that I try to address. And they fall in line with interpretation of destiny versus fate, and how these 3 illusions are a key to understand how do you either contribute to what I call the circle cycle, which is destiny, or how you lean more toward the spiral cycle, and that equate more with fate. So after that, the wiggle room and the number of choices you have are in contradistinction with said illusions. So you can see right there that just this tiny part of the book could constitute entire books in and of itself. And myself, as a person, I'll probably ponder upon these forever. Just one of the many aspects of the things I touch in the book.
Because your book gives so much leniency to individualization, do you see your book as kind of giving readers the tools or the prima materia, and it's up to them to kind of craft it? Or I guess how do you see that in terms of like the book being not the end all be all, but more of an invitation for individualization?
I can certainly assert from the get-go that truly what it is. It's an invitation more than everything else. What it does provide is a thorough, what I believe is a thorough retelling a thorough journey. So you're led through like this quest, or you're led through these many degrees and these many steps and these many operations. And if anything, it can show you the degree to which you can dive and how much deep you can dive into this if you really give yourself the time to. So that's what I wanted to convey. That's the scope of the subjectivity of the book and the scope of my own subjectivity. This would be an entire other conversation in of itself, but I won't go into it. But is certain subjectivities, plural, crossing each other's path in that certain kind of space in between where there's consensus, does that make up the general how we see objectivity? Or is objectivity something else entirely? And taking under account what I just said about observation, altering it, how should we ever be led to believe that we could observe objectivity without it automatically becoming a subjective thing? So, of course, the book is purely subjective. Hence, that pretty much destroy everything that you could bring forward as saying like, look, I'm giving you materials for you to work with. Actually, whatever I'm giving to you to work with could be plain air, could be something very intangible, this is not a formula that works its way independently of which vessel it is put into. It is, perhaps people could do something similar, of course, and say like, oh, so in alchemy in general, and that's not just my book, okay, there are 7 usual steps, and there's an 8th one, hence why I call it the Ogdoad. And all of these are pretty much, by convention, they are the way alchemy works since, the very discovery of the Emerald Tablet. So what I'm providing is, look, what I did with how to come about and create the Lesser Stone for myself, and how to ground my future work. How would you go at it? Like what I said earlier about not just a good movie, but I do believe there are things in there that if you resonate, like a good music or any work of art, because it is a work of art. It is a work of agape, because it's a work of love, but it's a work of art too. That's why they call it the royal art. It's alchemy. But really what I'm presenting is, for people to unlock their own mysteries. But it's only by presenting how I went at it for myself that you can reach that. And then afterward, if it doesn't speak to you, it doesn't speak to you, and that's okay. There's a reason why there's so many styles of music, because you might not resonate to the same chords or something like that. But if by any chance you really resonate at a deeper level with parts of the book, then it'll probably give you keys you could use for yourself as well, and directions. But, pointing into direction is one thing. That's what I believe the book does. So if, for instance, Alex, you come to me and you're like, hey, where's the nearest bar? I can, on a street corner, I can say, oh, it's over there, right? And point with my finger. Gives you a general direction. I can even give you, it's on the corner of this street and this street. And if you're not from around here, you might say, yeah, cool, but that's pretty confusing anyway, because I don't know the streets around. Of course, nowadays you could pick up your phone and pretty much be okay. But if I'm just pointing in a general direction, you'll be, hey, thank you. I did provide you with direction. I did provide you with useful information. But you're the one steering the boat. You're the one driving the car. You're the one who, takes that vessel and whether it be that bodily vessel or what have you, and you're still navigating or going in that general direction. Doesn't mean you're gonna find something there. It's very hard to say how it operates and how it'll impact other people. I just hope it will, as a way to unlock their own potential, as a way to express themselves, and just be like, oh, so if Gabriel went at it this way, this is pretty cool, but I believe I could reach similar result doing this.
What else about Auroræ haven't we covered yet that you really want listeners to know? What are some of the other major things that you really want them to keep in mind about Auroræ?
I touched upon this at the beginning of the conversation really briefly, but to me, alchemy is perhaps one of the most beautiful art form, but it's so much more than that ever existed. I see people having like a lot of interest for it, or a renewed interest for it, by usually studying very academically so the history of alchemy. But I seldom see a lot of real in-depth new work. Or perhaps it's just me. Perhaps I've missed them and I would wish I'd see more. Because I see a lot of reinterpretation of grimoires. I see a lot of new inspired spiritual books out there. But as far as like personal transformation goes, it's either like it goes automatically the route of being very new agey, type of like self-help type of thing, but not really like the very occult. And I don't see why this is not happening. In the book, I wanted to convey both my love of alchemy and how it's relevant still to this day to keep alive as a traditional art form, but also, on the other side, Luciferianism. For me, it is so not well represented. It's very hard to explain why exactly, but I do hope that it gives like a general vision of Luciferianism that's a bit more interesting than just the dark fluff that you see around. For me, there's a kind of like a self-elitism that goes with Luciferianism. And when I say this, I know it's a loaded term to use because it has nothing to do with the us and them type of mentality. It has nothing to do with comparison of two bodies, of people, of groupings, of mentalities. It's really a way to be thorough and be almost aggressive with the self in order to create that internal pressure we keep on referring to. So that self-elitism to me is super important, and I'll see huge problematics with books that don't respect even what they're trying to teach or what they're trying to say in their book, whether it be from the presentation, whether it be from the lack of rigor when it comes to typos, and these are minute things, but it's all in the minutia. It's all in the way that, of course, you want to shine a light. And if you want to shine a light, well, you cannot, to me, there's a lack of respect to what I feel Luciferianism is or could be. And that's where I'm even asking myself a lot of questions. Even I myself, I'm asking a lot of questions that perhaps it is just wishful thinking. Perhaps the way I'm seeing Luciferianism and the potential therein is more wishful thinking than actual reality, based on empirical evidence, it seems, of what we see around. And what I see around is it is not the noble thing that I believe it can be. It hasn't reached its full potential, that's for sure. But if I can tell you one thing, and it's not to say that there's not great things out there about Luciferianism too, really there is, but it's just like it's a matter of opinion on the general whole. I want to say that this book is perhaps the first among many that hopefully people will understand where I'm coming from and want to also participate in making sure that if Luciferianism is to be a thing, it's going to be a thing of beauty and a thing that is quality, quality over quantity, that's for sure. This to me was super important to get out of the book. I would want people to, or would wish people to fully dive into the book and really look at the pictures also, because the artwork, we have to go back to the artwork. The artwork themselves are a grimoire. They really are. Jose did not just an amazing job, but I know the guy is so dedicated. It's just like it became like a combined project, and it wasn't meant to be at the beginning. But when I saw to which extent he dedicated it and how he resonated, so that's a good thing too. See, when I was saying that I don't know how the book if the book will create something or if the book will produce a reaction out of the reader, but it did with Jose, and he created all those masterful artwork. So I can only imagine if somebody else is like whether it be with writing or art as well, or something else entirely, or perhaps just like how they decide to use this to better their life, how it could probably help. It doesn't go the new age route, but it's certainly a way. It helped me in my life, and I hope it will also help people. So that's what I want people to get out of this book.
To that point, Gabriel, here is the final quote about this specific tome, Auroræ, that we'd like to share, and then have you comment on that and talk about the final conclusions that you have for Auroræ. But here's one of the quotes that you have. Am I to contemplate the flame before it is even lit? Am I to scry the crystal before it is even formed deep in the earth's bosom? Before man rips the embryo from the womb to chisel and polish it in his own image, thinking absurdly that he improves upon an already perfect thing? Can you just share with our listeners, Gabriel, about these concluding lines and what you want them to know about the book?
Yeah, it's one of my personal favorite passages, I guess. And it encompasses a deep question, one you would probably ask yourself in the mirror if you're very honest with yourself. It is also a wink hinting at a lot of people are very, very invested, and almost maddeningly so, invested into, as soon as they hear about magic, as soon as they develop an interest for it, as soon as they get their first grimoire, they start from the get-go. And it's a good way. I mean, you can certainly dive in head first before even understanding what the work's about, but more so without even understanding yourself properly. And this entire quote sums up this. It sums up why would you try to observe something that is a light that is greater than yourself if you don't know about even the mundane self, if you don't know much about your inner desire, your hidden kind of personality and all of this? Why would you want to chisel on something without even knowing if it's even perfect from the get-go? That's also something, because you need to understand that your perception of it, say you're looking at something, it's kind of like you're looking at a painting. You'll be like, oh, I would totally add some red there, but it's not yours, or you don't know if it's already perfect as it is, and you throwing some red there might completely fuck it up, right? Because you haven't taken the time to fully understand and get a general sense of what the painting's about. I love this quote because it tells you to ask yourself so many goddamn questions and really look yourself very hard in the mirror before you try to even begin on this journey. And I wish somebody would have told me that. As I'm getting older, I'm revisiting the same concept or these quotes. I could revisit these quotes on a periodical basis, pretty much, because they are needed at various instances in life.
Cannot thank you enough for sharing about that, Gabriel. And Auroræ, of course, we'll put a link to the description to the book in the video description. It is from Anathema Publishing, which I know you are very familiar with, considering this is your publishing company.
Yeah, it was one of those things. I do remember a few years ago when I was almost finished with the book, I was talking to some other publishers about it, and a couple of them showed interest. After a while, I was seeing how Anathema progressed and seeing how beautiful the books that I was putting out were. I was like, well, now it wouldn't make any sense to even suggest it to somebody else, because I can remain in full control of my own book, and also I will completely make sure that the end product is exactly how I intended it to be. And sure enough, I mean, I must say that I had a pinch to the heart, when I received the book home. I was like, these are so gorgeous. I mean, it's really something. It's even more than I deserve, I think. But it's really just in and of itself as a product and as an object, as a talismanic object, it's out of this world beautiful. I couldn't be happier, of course. So being that it's my first book too, I mean, it's almost like a checkbox check moment, in life.
Is there anything, Gabriel, in terms of you want the listeners to know about upcoming projects, upcoming authors? Is there anything that you want them to really keep in mind about what's on the horizon with Anathema Publishing?
Oh, yeah. Well, first and foremost, I'll say this right now. Like, I'm immensely grateful that you've been kind enough to invite me back on the show. I mean, like I say, like, I'm a fan. I try to spread the message because it's a great, great show. I really like it. And that you've been kind enough also to review and go through my first book is, something that I really like. I'm thankful for. And I want to congratulate you on such a fine job that you're doing with the podcast. This is great, Well,
thanks. Well, cheers to you and your success as well. Thank you.
Yeah. I run pretty much all the day activities of Anathema Publishing. I do have a bit of help now. I got this copy editor, Evan Davis, amazing, cool guy, like very responsive, very helpful, helps me with some of the things I don't have the time to review completely before I get to. Well, usually we work in tandem, so I'll edit and correct a bit, and he'll do like a lot of the work, but everything else is still pretty much a one-man enterprise. I'm super happy of how the company is developing. We have a brand new website at anathemapublishing.com. We're checking out. And yeah, there's many, many projects in the work. Recently just released our first paperback reissue, actually, of a past sold-out title. I wasn't sure if I was gonna ever do this, but it seemed there was a window of opportunity there. And I'm not saying this is gonna be something that necessarily I'm gonna do from there on all the time. It's really by a title-to-title basis, because otherwise the money is too scarce and I have to focus more of the attention and focus more on the money on the new projects. But it seemed worthwhile because the first hardback book that Anathema ever did in 2016 was Crafting the Art of Tradition by Shani Oates, and it sold out pretty quickly because back then we could only do about 300 copies, which was very little. So, and it's such a fascinating read. It's it's one of my personal favorite book about traditional craft, one of my favorite Shani Oates title to this day. And it's not because I got to publish it. It's truly because alongside Tubello's Greenfire, I believe it's one of their stronger books. So yeah, we really re-released that in paperback, so that's pretty cool. And it's a bit less expensive for people to acquire, of course. And quite soon, super excited, it's Craig Williams' second opus with Anathema Publishing. It's a mind-boggling, but truly in the best sense, and a very truly occult book by Dr. Williams. It's entitled The Cult of Golgotha. It'll be superb. I really like the materials that we chose, and I love the layout, and it's just I cannot wait to receive the physical copies at the HQ. Craig really outdid himself. I mean, it's really out there. I won't lie. You really need to talk to him about it because it's completely unique. As much as Entering the Desert was written in a way that it was a bit more simple to understand than his previous efforts, it was open to people of any systems to interpret and work with. This one really goes deep into the quantum realms and deep into the very magical aspects. And so I cannot wait to have the reaction of practitioners and, and people who are very versed into the topics that he tackles. Hopefully by the end of the year, we'll get to publish 2 new authors on Anathema. That is Patrick John Larrabee with his upcoming book, Ceturos, and my good friend Ellen Arts, along with Don Webb, of course, who is pretty well known already. They'll do this new book about the left-hand path, aptly titled The Last Path on the Left, and I believe it will be mandatory for people who are kind of curious about the left-hand path. I believe it'll not solve a lot of issues, but it will certainly answer a lot of questions. There's a lot to come. There's a lot of wonderful books that are in the making that are full of insights and wisdom for the seekers out there. I couldn't be happier for that.
Just cannot thank you enough, Gabriel, just for taking the time. Is there anything else, Gabriel, as we wrap up here? Any other final thoughts or anything else you'd like to let our listeners know?
I see a couple of trends out there that are sometimes particularly annoying or disappointing, really. Disappointing would be a better word, but especially on the social medias, all the beautiful echo chambers that it creates. But if I had to address a few things that I believe I'm kind of tired or disappointed to see is first off, I don't know what is it with the trend, but I'd say, like, stop trying to hack your way through life. You know, you see those life hacks everywhere. I don't know why people don't rather, you know, it took me 10 years to write Auroræ, right? And it's by no means perfect, and it will never be. But I don't know. Some people truly should stop trying to hack their way through life and rather take the time that's required to learn how to navigate or use life more efficiently. So for me, life hacks are really for dummies. I don't get that. And I see this in the occult world as well. I see this in so many ways. I see this like, it's more of a personal opinion though, but I see this when people trying to express certain patterns, behavioral patterns that are really disrespectful and are massively depressing, really. But I absolutely detest these short shortcuts, and people are also like that. They want to bring in personal politics into any type of magical circles, you know. I hate it when it infiltrates like in insidious manners, like the supposedly spiritual teachings. You'll see this from figureheads, you know, in the occult community and influential people too. I don't believe it necessarily has a place when it comes to matters of the esoteric pursuit. It might be something pernicious that I see that I particularly dislike, and it's okay if you think it has its place, but for me there's a place and time for everything, and I don't see why we should bring the folly of everything that has to do with the political spectrums and the positions, and when you're exploring so-called like transcendental practices and topics, I think there's something truly wrong with priorities if we're going there. I'm not saying it's not something important in your life, or it's important to situate yourself in any type of mundane matters and to care for those values. This is primordial, of course. But, you know, like on the internet and all of this, to see this being applied and all constantly being bombarded by this, I think it tarnishes the great work. Don't you think?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that obviously politically and all of that, it's, look, just like you said, it's important to have values. It's important to make sure that, you know, everyone has an equal voice and everyone is, you know, everyone's able to do exactly what they want to do with no barriers and all that stuff. But all that being said, I agree with you. And I think that is the, like, with Glitch Bottle, the overall focus of the podcast is, you know, always focusing on the work. And whether that's grimoire work or spiritual work, it's focusing on the work and exactly not getting bogged down in, you know, oh, this political trend or this political issue, right?
It weighs you down, really. And it's okay if personally you want to work on both fronts, and that's okay too. But I see this as a huge overflowing of ego whenever I see these things kind of infiltrating everywhere, and the attacks and all of this, and the amount of presuppositions that goes with it, and vilification that is very unwarranted. But anyway, that's just my personal opinion. But I'd say, like, as an advice, I'd say, like, first of all, don't believe in shortcuts or life hacks, because I think that's appalling and that's very funny too. And screw politics when it comes to the occult. I mean, I see this dichotomy, or I see rather this way of people trying to pile in on the top of each other with their opinion, and it seems like everybody wants to be the king. People will never admit that they could be the pawn too, which is understandable. But I see, usually I stay very silent concerning these things, because I see huge flaws in both positions. Whether you envy somebody, or whether you're envied, or, you know, or whether you speak louder, or you're the more shy type. I mean, is there anything wrong with staying in the shadow of self-reliance and being accountable for oneself, and that's it? To me, I believe it's a more healthy way to live. If the game's not for you, and say you really want just like to step on people, you should probably stay off the chessboard completely. You know, there are other ways and modes of living out there and see the world than just this black and white dynamic, you know. And I believe usually that the occult provides an excellent gateway for you to discover these dynamics, if you let it. So my last words or suggestion I would have, a healthier way to live.
That's the number one message that I try and always hold to as well, which is, and I hope is reflected in the overall show, and I know is reflected in your work, is just focus on the work. Keep all the political crap outside of the occult and focus on the work that's in front of you. I love it. I love it.
The internal work, and as well as doing actual real life changes and actions to support, the internal work. Just doing this, not spewing hatred or spewing kind of weird opinions and being all crazy on the internet. Just the simple things in and of itself, I believe, elevates your entire occult game, so to speak.
Gabriel McCaughry, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us again on the Glitch Bottle podcast.
My absolute pleasure, Alex. Let's do this again soon.
And thank you for listening to this episode of the Glitch Bottle Podcast and helping us uncork the uncommon this fine day or night or wherever you happen to occupy space-time in your occult lairs, your summoning towers, or your cloistered libraries of the esoterically awesome. You can check out previous episodes and other magical Glitch Bottle news on YouTube, youtube.com/glitchbottle, and subscribe and download free episodes anytime on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and on Spreaker.com. Just search Glitch Bottle and enjoy. Also, please make sure to subscribe and follow us on Twitter at Glitch Bottle, all one word. Our intro music is the track Tornado by David Zeste. Our magical interest is fueled by sincerity, passion, amazing guests, and a copious amount of clinking coffee cups. Until next time, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.